let's give a warm welcome to Gregory Cajete. Thank you.
As we say in my language, my name is Gregory Cajete. I'm from Santa Clara Pueblo, and I am a long-time teacher, going on 50 years now. So hopefully, knock on wood, I'll have a few more years. I did teach at the Institute of American Indian Arts, mostly on the old campus, and then on the interim campus, which was at the College of Santa Fe. And I did do a little bit of teaching when this campus just opened. So I've been involved with the Institute, at least at that time, for 21 years. Then I moved on to the University of New Mexico, where I was the American Indian Education Specialist, and also later on became the Director of Native American Studies to rebuild the program there. So we do have a PhD now, as of last year, in Native American Studies. But that was my last work before I left, and retired in 2020, just when the COVID hit. So I've been kind of a freelance scholar since that time, also doing some art when I have a chance, and doing a lot of presentations like this. This morning my grandson came by. He's 13 years old, and he was asking me what I was going to be doing today, and I said, well, I'm going to be giving this presentation here. Oh, you're going to be doing one of those esoteric things. And so I asked him, where did you learn that word, esoteric? I heard about it.
Esoteric.
He heard it on his favorite show, The Wisdoms. So if you haven't had a chance to get a sense of indigenous humor, get onto Netflix. I think it's on Netflix. And get into the resident scene. They're esoteric in their own kind of way. So what I want to do today is really introduce you to native science. I am, before actually I came to the Institute and became the science teacher at the Institute of American Indian Arts in 1974, I was actually a field biologist. I was working, had just completed my degree in biology, and was working with the Forest Service up in Las Vegas area. And then I decided I didn't really like, I liked biology, but I didn't like the culture of natural resource management. That's a whole story unto itself. But I also had a degree in sociology and a minor in education. So I was asked, at that time I had done my student teaching at the Institute in downtown, which is now the Santa Fe Indian School. And I decided to take on teaching science. At that time, the Institute had a high school that integrated science with art, with the cultural perspectives of students that were attending the Institute at that time. And it was both a challenge, but it was also a joy. So I sort of found my path accidentally. I was going into science, and I thought I still would. But the pull, especially working at the Institute and working with the students there, really grounded me in this notion of native science, because I was called in really within that first week of teaching at the Institute. I had done my student teaching there, so they knew me. The administration knew who I was. But Lloyd New, who was the president, or rather the director at that time, called me into his office and much like an artist creates or a choreographer creates a dance or does a theater screenplay. He wanted me to create a curriculum that integrated science with art, with the cultural perspectives of the students that attended the Institute at that time. Of course, we were getting students from all over the country, and practically every tribe was represented in one way or the other at the Institute. So I was given really a gift, I felt, and also a challenge, and that was to create a different kind of science, a different way of looking at science, an indigenous notion and perspective of what science was and is and could be. And so that began my path in 1974, and it's 50 years now, towards really exploring what I call native science. And so this is my good friend Sam English, let me use his photo, which I thought was exquisite and also really visually, as an image, reflected this notion of native science and native people as scientists. And so, although he's passed, I do use his iconic picture, on native science. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about really quickly, because it's a whole book, so I only have a short amount of time to sort of give you the highlights and perspectives of native science. And really, then I will go into really the work of Jean Berser in terms of this kind of perspective that he was doing from his perspective, his understandings, his ways of knowing. And what you're going to see, I hope, is that there's a parallel. And there has always been a parallel, because indigenous science is founded on those very basic primal ideas. And that's why we have an emergence myth and stories of origin. That's why the creation stories for every tribe is a very important kind of beginning story and allows us really to understand who we are, where we have come from, and in many ways where we're going. So there's a lot of philosophy in this native science, and of course it began with the work I did at the Institute all those many years ago, creating this curriculum of native science, integrating science with art, with the cultural perspectives of the students at the Institute at that time. And there are still vestiges. Actually, the different courses I taught have broken up into different programs, and there are still, herbology courses, and I think astronomy. They have a few astronomy courses. They have different kinds of courses that were part of that original older curriculum, still going at the Institute at this time. But again, in reading Jean's work, I was really very moved by the fact that there are so many parallels. But if you haven't studied native science, you're not going to see those parallels. I have the ability to study both Western philosophy, Western science, and at the same time, as a tribal member, as an indigenous person, I've gone all over the world and worked with indigenous people, indigenous artists, and indigenous scientists now, actually, in the kind of things that we are doing in indigenous scholarship. Unfortunately, indigenous scholarship, indigenous perspectives are still very much off the radar screen of mainstream. If you haven't taken the time, energy, or effort to specifically study indigenous ways of knowing, some of this will probably be new to you. But on the other hand, it may not be new to you because you also have a frame of reference that people like Jean, have sort of given you, and other scholars, have given you in terms of the perspectives that we now see beginning to sort of, these streams of thought are sort of coming together in some very interesting and synchronistic ways. So my presentation is a relational mindful science, a native perspective. And I want to give you something of a background of why at this point in my career I'm writing, which is really the sequel to this book. this is going to be the sequel to this book, Native Science, is that I see, so I had a natural interest in the natural world growing up in Santa Clara Pueblo, growing up in my extended family, farming, being out in nature extensively, encountering nature in a very direct way. And I think that was really what motivated me to take biology, particularly a focus on plants, as my major when I went to my undergraduate studies. But as and I had been introduced to Western science certainly in high school, but as I was being introduced to science in the Western classroom, it was very obvious that there was no indigenous thought. No thought about the indigenous and no indigenous thought whatsoever. And that was something I had to deal with because I knew that we had a lot of knowledge, a lot of understanding, a lot of perspectives that were not a part of that curriculum. And it was kind of confirmed when I went into work as a biologist for the Forest Service in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Because what I saw there was basically a very, very closed culture. Racially, intellectually, in many ways. And unfortunately, that was normal in terms of whether you went into biology, you went into physics, or you went into chemistry, any of those cultures, and I'm talking about the social cultures of the actual doing of science, were largely closed and closed to thoughts and ideas and perspectives, quote unquote, of the indigenous. And so that motivated me, of course, again, when I was offered that opportunity to create a curriculum that integrated science with art, the cultural perspective of Native people. So this is something of what, and again, I know that you're looking at the theme of the dance of the feminine and the masculine, and that whole notion of balance. And that's very much a part of indigenous science, native science. It's about balance between that feminine energy and that masculine energy. What I found in Western science, both in terms of its practice and culture, was it was overtly and extremely masculine. And not just masculine, but masculine with a certain viewpoint, which we're dealing with actually as we speak in 2 weeks with the election. That's what I encountered. All those almost 50, again, actually it's 50 years ago. That was 50 years ago. And actually in some ways it hasn't changed. It has actually intensified in many regards. And so that led me to really think, what do I need to do? As a sequel to this book, which really outlines the history of indigenous science, indigenous people's contribution to science. What would be the appropriate sequel to that? Well, for me, it's a mindful science. It's a way of being trained as a Western scientist and also being trained as an indigenous person and also indigenous scientist, because I know a lot about plants, because my family knew a lot about plants and their uses. So here we are, 50 years later, and I'm giving this presentation, a relational mindful science. And that's a challenge as much as it is a title, to a presentation. How do we create a relational and a mindful science? Well, actually, it's been going on all along, but it's been going on in the margins. It's the esoteric, it's all of the kinds of things that we've been talking about in this conference today. In terms of, it's certainly going on, I have to say, in indigenous circles, because I'm privy to a lot of indigenous people, a lot of indigenous scholars working in different parts of this question, creating and mindful indigenous science from a native perspective. So with that, I'll go ahead and start. A good friend of mine passed away a few years ago. His name was Conrad House. I use this because for me, he was able to capture that ecological view of indigenous people, of native science, if you will. You can see in that lower left-hand corner, there is the native eye, and that's the title of this particular piece. It's a pastel collage. But what he's done is he's depicted plants and animals, the eagle, the bear, the morning star, the moon, the sun, the moon, the turtle, the antelope, mother corn, and all of those geometric forms that are the energies of nature that we are also a part of, that the native eye sees, and that the native eye is also, the native person is also a part of. So in one image, he was able to capture the essence of what native science is really about. And so I call this interdependence a tapestry of relationship through the native eye. And again, this gives you a sense of how art, the power of art, to really bring home the essence of very, very complex ideas and really sort of embed it in our minds, in our thoughts, in our soul, if you will. So what is native thought? Well, in a Western philosophical sense, its axiology, its focus, lies in the balance of relations, lies in the balance of relations. Its epistemology, observing, doing, making, symbolizing rhythm and ritual and ceremony. These are the ways that one comes to knowledge. Its logic, all elements and beings of the multiverse are linked together. So it's not just a sense of a universe. There's this universe, this great carrier, but within that universe are nested multiverses. Ad infinitum, from the macro to the micro. And the process is working with the understanding that all things are dependently interrelated in the harmony and balance of the multiverse, including that notion of the feminine and also the masculine. And so again, 8,000 year old medicine wheel in Wyoming, a mechanism without moving parts that anticipates the coming of summer solstice and winter solstice and is able to mark it. Okay. So, again, what I want to emphasize is that native science did have multiple kinds of technologies, but they were coming from a different worldview, a different understanding of people being a part of, participating with the universe in this kind of collective dance, this theme, of dance. And so, first insights, going back to that creative process, first insights. Native science is a product of a different creative journey than Western science. It's the most ancient form of human science. And it is very much grounded in what you've been studying, what you've been talking about. So I took a few notes on what Gene Gerbser was talking about, and I looked at his 5 structures of consciousness, him calling them mutations rather than structures. His idea that there was an origin, that origin is really when humans become conscious of not so much chronologically, but through the arts. It's been a very powerful way of looking at how art has changed from those first paintings in the caves of Lascaux, all the way to the modern art being produced right here at the Institute and other art schools, in terms of how art reflects that awareness, that consciousness that is evolving. And his idea that all of these kinds of consciousness, from the most ancient form of that first origin consciousness, sense of origin, to the present time, lives within us and can be experienced, actually, if we become aware that it's there. Okay, so those ideas, I think, are very important. He said all structures are latent in us, regardless of our current structure. They're within us. And so, again, implications for psychology, the esoteric, and also philosophy and science and art. So these were some of the thoughts and ideas that sort of brought me to think about how these parallels happen in native science. Native science is a metaphor for native knowledge. It's the stories of the world that include the creative ways for living and participating in relationship. It's a relational science with the world through processes for seeking life, relationship, and meaning. Here's that purpose that was mentioned, that purpose, that perspective, that way of process philosophy. And so, this is a mound builder, star priest, probably greeting the sun. Actually, he's a sun priest, based on his designs. So he's a sun priest greeting probably the summer solstice sun. But the whole complex and understanding of participation, a dance with the universe, humans being an integral part of the natural world, not apart from, but an integral part of it. And that idea of seeking life. So in my language, we have same githam. Biwo and ini. So we say, good day, be with life. It's a good day. Or you can say it's a good day to be with life. Okay, either way. But it's that saying that's a part of the language itself that brings you to the epistemology and the understanding of native science in this way, in this relational way. The prayer to the sun is establishing that relationship and remembering that relationship through words, through action, through symbol. Native science reveals itself through abstract symbols, visual, spatial, reasoning, sound, kinesthetic expression, the various forms of creative, ecological, integrative, and spiritual thinking. This is why native science is expressed through story, through art, through song, through dance, through ritual, through music, through community, through hunting, through fishing, through farming, through healing, through architecture, and astronomies, and there could be many others added to that list. The representations, of art, are so extensive. And this is Casa Rinconada, Chaco Canyon, 2 hours from here.
There you go.
As close to a perfect circle as can be made with human measurement, measurement from the elbow to the index finger, from the index finger all the way to the insertion. All of these are human measurements. And this was the technologies, that all human beings had at one time and used extensively. The building of Stonehenge is an example of that as well. And the use of, because it's based on the human body, the use of measurement also had a soulful spiritual So again, you take any aspect of indigenous life and you'll find all of these elements, but you'll also find in those elements expressions of what I call native science, including that architecture of Chalco Canyon. Native science and native knowledge. So if you're looking for a definition, native science is a multi-contextual song, dance, music, architecture, etc. system of thought, action, and orientation applied by an indigenous people through which they interpret how nature works in their place. So native science is a very place-based kind of knowledge. So different tribes will have different kinds of native science. They'll have, so that one should not say native science, one should say native sciences. Okay? Because every tribe interprets and contexts their knowledge in the place that gives them life. Native knowledge, the high context body of knowledge built over many generations and distinct people living in a place in relationship to its plants, its animals, its water. So I guess that image just kind of jumped up because when I was putting it on, it was supposed to be in the right place. Anyway, we have a lot of stories about all of this. Okay? This is why the oral tradition in native contexts are so important to those tribes, because it's the carrier, the linguistic carrier of that knowledge from one generation to the next. And so, and again, it was so for most human cultures until probably about 10,000 years ago. When we began to develop written forms of story. Again, native knowledge. They're all doing it now. So the development of knowledge is guided by spirituality. Ring a bell? Spirituality. Ethical relationship. Mutualism. Reciprocity. Respect. Restraint. A focus on harmony and an acknowledgement of interdependence. That very first image I showed you images all of these thoughts, these perspectives. And so this knowledge is integrated with regard to a particular place towards the goal of long-term sustainability. The other characteristic of native knowledge is that it's sustainable. It's about sustainability. It's about sustaining the people in a place through time and through generations, through special kinds of compacts and relationships they have made with each other, with the world around them, with their place, with the plants, with the animals, with the sun, with the moon, with the earth itself. And so these integrations, these perspectives, are very much a part of this understanding. And some of this is actually in Western ecological practice and thought, but even Western ecology is a kind of a newbie, into Western science. It's not, and even for that, sustainability is only like 30 years old, as quote unquote a science discipline. So a lot of these thoughts and perspectives have recently, they've been there in bits and pieces, but they've been codified into quote unquote disciplines, in the Western canon. They've been the guiding canon for indigenous science, all along. And so that's why there's a kind of parallel in the meeting of streams of knowledge between the Western ecological knowledge and philosophy and native science, because they're basically saying the same thing in different words, but also still from a different worldview. Okay, that's also, the streams haven't come together completely because they're coming from two different worldviews still. Okay. So you have the masculine and the feminine. And what we're now seeing also is the rise of the in-between. And that's the liminal space.
Yeah.
The in-between space. And that energy is the energy that brings things together. Okay? So native science was very cognizant of the liminal space, that in-between space. And certainly, in science, that in-between space is, quantum physics. It's a variety of different kinds of new sciences that are beginning to explore the liminal. But again, here's one of my early paintings. I thought when I was in high school, so I found a bunch of old photographs and I tried to restore them, but in the younger days. But again, the idea of image capturing certain thoughts. This particular one is, as I remember, I was impressed with the Huichol Indians have this saying, and this also is a part of the ballads that you hear in Mexican music, Canto de Flor, which is flower and song. And so flower and song comes from a Nahuatl philosophy and saying, in which you sing your prayer, you think your prayer, you walk your prayer. And that's what I was trying to capture there in that image of and this one is called the asking, and you can see the sun, the morning star, the different pathways, the clouds, the rainbow, all of those are listening, to that asking, that being that's asking. And so as you begin to think about these things, we begin to understand a lot of the perspectives that I think are important in terms of indigenous thinking and Western thinking, particularly in terms of these parallel streams of thought. Oral transmission, practical application oriented. So native science was also very practical. Places like Chaco Canyon could not have been built if there was not a practical science involved with native science. All the forms of hunting and fishing and the intricate artworks that native people produced, all of those were also part of that practical aspect of native science. Because it was about surviving, it's about sustainability as much as it was about, really being true to that original thought, that original perspective. There are several, I remember one of my colleagues wrote a book called Original Instructions. And so there's, in native philosophies, there are a lot of references to that original thought, the original perspective. So observation of time, observation over generations, the importance of the oral tradition, the cyclic time orientation, moving through cycles. Thursday was the hunter's moon. Those of you who are hunters, all the hunters know the hunter's moon, and because that's the moon telling you it's time to go hunting, and it's the opening of that hunting time. And specific cultural literary styles and symbolism. Each tribe has its own way of conveying these thoughts, these ideas, these perspectives. And knowledge is contextualized to a specific tribal culture and place. And the Pyramid of the Sun, the Teotihuacan, and the complexities all embody in that architecture native science. So what are some of the protocols of native science? Native science, or indigenous science as I also call it, integrates a spiritual and ethical orientation to the interactions with nature. It's a dynamic, multi-dimensional harmony in a perpetual state of, is the perpetual state of the universe. So the idea of balance is not a static balance, but it's a perpetual changing, always changing, very dynamic process. And you can see this in nature. You can see this in the changes of seasons. You can see this in us as we move from childhood to adulthood to old age. Okay, you can see and you can feel this, and so that dynamic, multi-dimensional harmony is what Native people were very cognizant of. Traditional knowledge is related to the guiding stories of emergence of humans into the world. And so a lot of tribes have what we call emergence stories of humans emerging into this world, learning what they need to do, being given instructions. But as humans and human nature, which I really do see reflected with each generation, we tend to forget. We tend to go in other directions. And then something happens. That world is destroyed. A few survive. There's the next world they have to emerge into. New, more complicated, new instructions to follow, and so on and so forth. You know? So again, that notion of human nature, very ancient, but yet very much in the present. You know, as we look at it in those terms. Humanity has an important role in perpetuation and sustainability of natural processes in the world. A notion that unfortunately has not been heeded, and certainly has to be, I think, now a consideration. Science must be balanced and include both the feminine and masculine energies of the multiverse. There is much knowledge in the liminal space, in between these opposites. So I think it's important really then to look at Gene Gerber's work in that constance. You know, as I said, he looks at structures of consciousness, mutations of origin. The idea that there's an original consciousness that humans had, okay? And again, human nature, which is that trickster, the human nature is that trickster, then comes into play, and mutations begin to happen with that original consciousness, mutations through time, through experiences. All of these structures are alive and inside us and bring us, or bring its own perspective on self and the world. So we're in different places at different times, okay? And you just have to look at your own personal life and see the different kinds of consciousness that we're working on you at that particular time. And as you look back, begin to think, oh my God, why was I doing that? You know, and that's that perspective. So, but the idea is that the ancient actually is still within us, and in many ways, it has a kind of way of deeply calling us again. And so, if you again, the esoteric consciousness, if you take a look at astrology, you take a look at different kinds of healing forms that have come into being. I was talking to one of my colleagues who's into intuitive medicine, and is going to write a book on it. You look into Taoism, you look into Hinduism, you look into Sufism, you look into all of these. And these are ancient forms, you know, of knowledge as well. And people are feeling called back to those So that's that consciousness calling us back, I think. But that idea of origin is our first awareness of a creator, our first human awareness of the creator. The brain, you use brain biology, the brain, something happened to our brains some 1,000 years ago that allowed us to begin to think in this way. Somehow we became mindful of something, that we were connected, that we were part of creation. Somehow we became mindful of that. Our brains changed to allow that to happen. He talks about the unperspectable, the archaic, the magic, the mythic, the ancient, the communal mind. And then he talks about the perspectival, the mental, the mechanical, the linear, the measurable, in which the ego also has arisen. And then he talks about the A perspective, freedom from perspective, reintegration of ancient and a new integration of the original wholeness. Past, present, and future are one. One you would call it a super ego. So again, we're coming almost full circle again. It's interesting, as you explore ancient forms of science, as you explore modern forms of science, as you explore all of the different kinds of philosophers who have reflected on these thoughts and these ideas through time, we begin to see that there's a circle forming. What we do with it, I think, is very important. Where we go with that knowledge, that perspective, is very important. So with me, I'm writing, the sequel to Native Science. And the reason why I'm writing that is because we are getting more Native people into science and engineering fields. But guess what? They're having exactly the same kinds of issues I had with Western science. And it's not just the Indigenous students. It is not just the Indigenous students. It is everyone. So what does that tell you about the institutions? Well, the institutions haven't changed dramatically. It's still about power, command, control. It's still about politics. They haven't, the institutions haven't kept up with what is actually happening among people. People are beginning to think in these ways, these more broader ways. It's, as Gerber has said, a perspective. We're beginning to become free from that perspective, and there's a reintegration of those original thoughts, those original instructions, but in a new way, and hopefully a life-sustaining way once again. So that's the message I have for you with regard to Native science. I'll go and study Native science, go on and work with my next book, which is really also a curriculum, but it's a curriculum for higher education. Many of my students are getting their doctorates in various sciences. They're having the same kinds of problems with the institutions that they're working with. Their knowledge, their understanding, and Native knowledge continues to be marginalized. So I'm giving them a curriculum that on their own, if they want to read, if they want to learn Native science and combine it with Western science and live in that liminal space, which is really that creative space, then I think you're going to see some real amazing things happen. And I've seen that already with a lot of young Native scientists as they're working. So with Native arts, for example, this was one of the only areas, Native arts specifically, where we were able as Native people collectively to participate, to grow, to develop, in our own, with our own perspectives, with our own ways, and also integrate Western ways of knowing. That was the only place, really, that was open to us. A little bit in terms of higher education in teaching, in the the teaching professions, which I went into, was a place that was also open for Native people to sort of come in. And I see in teaching now that Native people are really evolving and developing their ways of teaching. New perspectives are being brought in. And so I want to see the same thing happen in Native science, where Native science becomes not just a marginal topic, if it is a topic at all in a higher education science classroom or in science philosophy, but it becomes part of a conversation. And the way that you do that from an education standpoint is you create a curriculum that teaches for that outcome. So with that, what kind of curriculum are you guys going to create? And what do you want to create, as we move forward?
First question.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you. Try the other. Was that? No, that's.
I think I think you
Yeah,
just
we're recording.
Oh,
Yeah.
So bear with us just 1 second.
Okay, great. Thank you, first of all. Thank you very much. I appreciate what you had to share. I am teaching my last semester after 29 years as a professor right now. And I snapped a picture because I'm teaching a class, a postgraduate course this semester in theory and theory building.
yeah.
And so we had spent the first month of the course reading about axiology and ontology and praxeology and voice. And all of these were foreign concepts to these students who knew what little they knew about science in the way that everybody's taught, which is you put on a lab coat and you step outside of things, and you can't interact with them, and you don't exist, and all of that. So I snapped a picture of one of your first slides, and I sent it to my class.
Really?
Yeah. And
That's good.
right away, 3 of them responded, and they said, I've got to get to these conferences. So I want you to know that a group of graduate students in Sacramento, California found what you said meaningful and important.
Well, wait till they read Native Science.
Well, I'm going to get the details from you. The question I have for you is actually, I'm just wondering, are you familiar with the ancient building called Newgrange in Ireland?
Yes.
So it's 1,000 years older than Stonehenge, which the Irish take great pride in. It's 250 feet in diameter.
Yes.
It's a circular building, 14 feet high.
Yeah.
And we don't know what it was for. There are glyphs around it that are in, what do you call it? Spirals, thank you. And half of them go in one direction and half of them go in the other.
Right.
And where they meet, there's a door, and above the door is a window, tiny window. And only 5 days of the year does the light go all the way to the center of the building, and those 5 days are the winter solstice.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this touches on what you talked about. It also touches on some things that we talked about today about the calendar being geared to nature.
Yes.
And this idea of us being not disconnected from, or as you said, apart from nature, but that we are a part of nature. So I appreciated your comments, and so did my graduate students.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. No, I'm out of academia. I don't have to go to the die by reading situations. I don't die by faculty meeting. But this is already in the air. I mean, and it's especially younger scientists, the students that are in higher education now. They're all
They get it.
They're open to it.
Yeah.
It's just our administrations, our institutions, are not, and it's because there's so much vested interest and vested economics in keeping things the way they are. And until that changes, but I think, revolution happens from the ground up anyway, so it's happening regardless. Yes.
Original revolution. 45.
So I'm interested in, how do I say this? It's kind of like the orientation in, let me contextualize it by starting in Western science. There's this orientation toward prediction.
Yes.
And I've noticed more of an orientation toward observation in native science.
Yes.
Generations, as you said, generations of observations, which, I don't know how you get those done in a classroom. It's like the world is your classroom. And I was in Colombia a few years ago, and visiting the Kogi tribe,
Yes.
and they are very, very tuned in to their place.
Sure.
And the government of Colombia wanted to build a roadway that would cut across an estuary, and it would essentially cut off the estuary. And the tribe tried to go to the government and say, don't do this. It's going to wreak havoc with the weather. We'll have floods in 7 years. And the government blew them off. And wouldn't you know it, the worst floods of all time came in 7 years.
Yes.
So there was something predictive
Yes.
that they could do, but even though their science isn't oriented toward prediction, and I'm just wondering, how does that observation prediction?
I think we have to examine it. There is a prediction, and very much like the astrology example you gave. We don't. It's kind of mysterious. We don't know communally. And it has to do with intuitiveness, that we neglect, but is very much a part of science, and knowing and understanding something, being aware of something. And so they have an intuitive understanding based on their observations. They have seen patterns. And the Kogi especially, they use what they call energy lines, and so they have various places where they go to meditate, and because of the ways that their people are, especially their medicine people are trained. They have they've retained that natural intuitiveness and have expanded it. And made that a part of their observation of patterns. And so they were observing the patterns that were there, and we were cautioning, if you obstruct these patterns, things are going to happen, because they were looking at ultimately at a quantum physics level, or at a level of energy, everything gives off energy. And if you're able to read the energy, you're able to understand the patterns, and where patterns are obstructed, where things can happen. Energy has an interesting thing. It flows like water. If it's obstructed one way, it'll move another way. But it'll also cause changes in other patterns of energy that are happening in the nature simultaneously to that. And so that's probably what I would think they were talking about. And so that's their form of native science, and very true. If you notice, there's been major hurricanes, major climate change events happening in the Gulf of Mexico and throughout that whole region, that whole area.
So you've just suggested a whole new opening for me, which is looking at the
Yeah, I just did a telecast to Scotland, University of Dundee, and they're studying there. We have, I remember an exercise I used to use for the students at IIA where I asked them to draw energy. So everything has energy. So how would you draw, something like that, which is energy? Or how would you draw heat, that you can't see, or how would you draw? So there's different ways of depicting. You can use different kinds of technologies to see, like infrared light and such. But how would you draw those energies?
New glyphs.
And so everything is energetic. Everything has an energy. And for Native people, energy is equivalent to spirit. Spirit and energy are the same thing. So that's why we say everything is alive, everything has energy, everything has spirit.
Karen's got the, we'll get to you, but I guess Greg is calling on her, so go.
Turn it on the side.
So how you
No,
mentioned
it's not on.
so I don't want to take up people's time. You mentioned forestry science
Yeah.
and how it used to be so stuck in the mud, so to speak. Is it still?
I would say to some extent, but there's younger scientists coming in with new ideas and perspectives, but it's still very, we recently had this fire in Las Vegas. It was a devastating fire. I happened to be at Highlands University at that time giving a talk, and I was staying in a hotel, the third floor of the hotel, and I was looking as there was smoke, and I said, why are they building a controlled burn? And the winds were like, you've ever been in Las Vegas, the wind pushes you along the sidewalk. Why are they starting a controlled burn in the middle of this? I come back from my talk about 2 hours later, and the whole mountain is on fire. It was the bureaucracy. It was that there was a controlled burn scheduled for that day. The people, the crews lit the fire. I mean, without thinking, are you going to write, that's the kind of thinking that continues to happen, unfortunately, in institutions and in places like before cities. So we're still dealing with the ramifications of that. And that example can be replicated in a lot of different ways. In the ways that different institutions and governments and even corporates have dealt with ecological, climate-related issues. And it's a kind of thinking, a kind of mindset. It's both institutional, but it's also egotistical and arrogant. All of those kinds of things that deal with conditionality, come into play as well.
Karen, Karen?
Let's see if this is working.
Oh, is this another thing? Got a lot of trickster energies on the mics. They're going in and out. They might want to go.
Can I go ahead and just?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, right.
I can hear you.
I know, it's for the purposes of.
Why don't you come a little closer here?
Oh,
Okay.
Greg, just repeat the question.
yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Well, first of all, just an observation has to do with the amazing amount of electrical storms we've been having the last 24 hours.
Yes.
And I just want to acknowledge
the possibility of the amplification of some of the things that we have been speaking about in the last 24, 36 hours. There's just some very interesting coincidences of the huge amount of rainfall that started very recently, and then all this lightning. I know people who've been here, lived here for decades, and are going, last night's light show was just absolutely amazing. So I just want to acknowledge that. But my question for you is, a lot of what we've been speaking about here has to do with how do we impart some of the knowledge, as you say, some of Jean Gabser's understanding is similar in some ways to some of the native science understandings. And how do we impart those understandings in ways that people who are not attuned to learning from books or from just lectures, but how do we impart that understanding at an embodied level, especially for people who are visual kinesthetic learners like myself? And I'm wondering if in your work with some of the native science teachers, if maybe there are some materials or some processes that maybe we could learn from so that we could also start implementing some things in the school systems so that the children can start embodying rather than just staying up here in their mental state. So that's just
Well, one quick response would be introduce mindfulness into the curriculum in in-depth ways, make it a part of the curriculum. And mindfulness specifically as it relates to connections to each other, the social, emotional learning, and also connection to the natural world. And it's all based on relationship.
All right, we'll go to you next.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, first of all, for speaking with us today. Much appreciated. And I guess I wanted to ask you, looking at Western science and native science, and it seems that, Western science kind of comes from a third-person observational way, and native science, to the extent that I have any understanding of it, just how you were talking about kind of a more instinctual, kind of a first-person experiencing, also all at the same time within a communal structure, right? So there's a kind of common sensing as well. And so I'm thinking about that liminal space between the two, and and that seems to be a big stumbling place. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how to bridge that.
Well, I think it's, first of all, you become aware of it, that it's always there. Second, you really begin to engage it. You begin to engage it. What is the it's the in-between place of what is happening or coming together in certain kinds of ways. It has to do with this idea of flowing with that energy of both the male and the female, and that perspective. Because remember, we're talking about an energy, and two different kinds of energies with different qualities are beginning to merge together. A good example is where, along the Amazon, where the Amazon is freshwater and it's pluming into the Atlantic Ocean, and the space that it's creating is a liminal space. It's melding together with salt water, fresh water and salt water, but there's a liminal space. And there's all kinds of things happening. It's one of the most productive biological spaces in the ocean, that liminal space. And the reason why is because the nutrients of both are coming together and they're integrating with each other, mixing together in a way that is dynamic and purposeful, and actually is full of life, energy, minerals, the energies and the viscosities of the waters. And so that's that liminal space. In an example in nature, we also have that in our psychology and in the ways that we look at each other, that the way we participate with nature, the way that we come together and interact with each other, there is always that liminal space. So exploring that, giving it its due, and really beginning to to understand that there's no real right and wrong. But the real truth lies in the middle. You know what I'm saying? And so this idea of liminal space, I think, has not had enough research, but it's now being researched extensively in a variety of different ways. And so artistically, the liminal space is that in-between space where there are a lot of artists, especially contemporary artists, who are beginning to really explore the both. It's also been called the both and. The both and. You know, where that space in the middle becomes a very productive, creative space in poetry, in also in science. In science, you know, so it moves beyond the duality and even the polarities of things.
I guess, you know, what I'm thinking is like this knowledge, this wisdom that is held, you know, it's like how to infiltrate it into the Western realm. And you know, you'd said earlier about grassroots. I mean, it seems like it's going to need to come from the bottom up and from the top down.
Yeah, it's happening already. I mean, if you study a lot of the contemporary movements, the philosophies, even what you're doing today, you know, in this workshop, with Jean's work, you know, all of that is exploring that liminal space in some shape or another. I see it going on all the time. Of course, it's not called that, liminal space exploration, but that's really what's happening, you know. And so the more of that happens, I think we'll become used to doing it in ways that allow us to really gain some truth and understandings from it. I'm a part of a course, a PhD course here at the Southwestern College here in Santa Fe, which is started out. I used to moonlight there, but I worked at IIA, True Confessions, and it started as art therapy, and it's and it produces MA counselors, you know. So we have a PhD program now called Regenerative Leadership, Visionary and Regenerative Leadership, and I'm teaching in that course, and we're exploring exactly what you're describing, the liminal space, where we're looking at what does it mean to regenerate, what are the foundations for that, and where does it emerge from, and what part of it is in us. And like was said, I think earlier, you have to recover from Western institutional higher education training first, you know, and then be open enough to go into a program like that. That really forces you to see what regeneration is first in yourself, and then how do you lead for that in whatever work that you're doing in the world.
Thank you.
Testing. I have several copies of your book, Native Science, and I highly recommend that I give it away to people who are in this space of learning about Indigenous science and a different way of seeing. I share the disillusionments that you expressed in regards to white Western scientific culture. I got alienated very early in the game at my dissertation defense in solar physics. Today, I feel so kindred with you, and to hear that you're going to write a sequel to that excites me incredibly. And I am now leading an education program embedded inside a NASA space science mission to study the sun and the space between the sun and Earth, and its impact on the Earth. We are working with a school on the Pueblo of Acoma, the Haku Community Academy, with 8th graders. We're very conscious of the possibility of exciting a polarity inside of them. How do we bring to them NASA science and learn from them and honor their cultural heritage, all of our cultural heritage, right? Without exciting that polarity in them. They're young people, they're forming their identities, and we want to maintain that traditional connection that you've been describing so beautifully, while also sharing with them the riches of NASA science, but also changing that culture of NASA science and letting them know how valuable they are if they can bridge those worlds early. And so what could our curriculum do to really help to bridge those worlds? And then just offering one example, since you mentioned Rinconada, and also this presentation that we had prior, this is one of our attempts, and I would love your response to it. Over here, if you could point, ladies, to that poster, is, maybe you could even hold it up. That poster is at Casa Rinconada, a great kiva in Chaco Canyon. The sunrise positions of equinox and solstice have been noted, right? So there, oh gosh, these are great. And we have taken this to a leading science meeting, 10,000 scientists, earth and space science in a Western culture. We put this in a NASA booth. 80% of the scientists, leading edge scientists, could not do this activity. Where will the sun rise? Where does the sun rise on your birthday?
On your birthday.
Right? And we have lost connection with this knowledge. This is an ancient way. Many of our ancestors who were all sun watchers, and we would be here, basically knew this, but we've lost the connection. So we take this to the Pueblo of Acoma and we invite the 8th graders, right, into this knowledge of how the sunrise position changes with time over the course of a year and how you can track time and ceremony with this. Now, how do we bridge that to contemporary science? We portray NASA's exploration of the sun's cycles as a natural extension of humanity's long-lived dedication to observing and predicting the rhythms and cycles of the sun. Yes? And so here, our NASA mission called PUNCH is going to help us live in harmony. I love that emphasis on harmony with the sun's magnetic activity cycle, just as our ancestors had to learn to live in harmony with the seasonal cycle. So we're bringing,
that eventually they'll have to give way, to this new paradigm. I call it in an indigenous context, I call it the native mind rising. And so, and I'm very happy to say that it's happening throughout the indigenous world. It's not on the news. It's not, but indigenous people know about it, and we're contacting each other. We're interacting with each other in so many different ways around, especially education, and now more so around science. So this bridge building that you're talking about actually is beginning to happen in small ways, but it's getting critical mass, and your program is part of that, I'm sure.
Thank you, Greg. Oh my God, that was fantastic, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for being our keynote speaker.